A leopard cub, found barely breathing in the heart of a storm-tossed sea, and a friendship the world has not forgotten. This story has stirred millions of hearts, and for over 20 years it has lived on, whispered across forest trails, passed between sailors on quiet nights, and kept alive in the winds of the Amazon. Deep in the Amazon, even now, tribes speak of a man, the one who saved a moon leopard, a creature said to appear only once every 100 years. And, they say, whoever lays eyes upon it will one day face a choice they cannot escape. But the tale didn't begin in any jungle, nor on a mountaintop. It began at sea. It was the summer of 2003. A nameless crate, caught in the fiercest storm that year, drifted across the mid-Atlantic aboard a merchant vessel bound from India to South America. A weary man, a nameless box, and something inside, not yet dead, but far from safe. No warning, no reason, just a pair of fading eyes and one man who could not turn away. What you're about to hear may not answer to logic, but it might stir something older, quieter, that still lives in all of us. A bond beyond species, beyond time. The ship Hope was bound for South America, cutting through the last stretch of open sea after a 3-month journey from the western coast of India. Her silver sails, soaked in salt and stiff with wind, billowed beneath a dimming sky, carrying not just crates and cargo, but also the quiet longing of her captain. But for Captain Author, this voyage was not just a crossing, it was a return. At home, across the sea, his father lay sick. And somewhere deep in his chest, Author carried a quiet urgency, the kind that tells a man he may not arrive in time to still be called son. He was not a man shaken easily. Years at sea had weathered him more thoroughly than the hull beneath his feet. But something about this voyage unsettled him. There was no sign, no proof, just a weight in the wind, as if the ship carried something that did not belong among men or salt or sky. Then came the storm. It struck as the Hope entered the Grelva Strait, a narrow passage sailors called the mouth of the angry sea. Within an hour, the skies had turned black. The wind howled like it was alive. Rain lashed the deck with the snap of whips. And the waves, great heaving walls of green and gray, rose taller than the masts and crashed down without mercy. The Hope groaned and staggered, not like a ship, but like a beast being dragged beneath the surface. In the midst of that chaos, 2 passengers, quiet men who had boarded weeks earlier in India, defied orders and fought their way to the main deck. There, they clung to a large tarp-covered crate lashed near the port rail. No one knew why they risked their lives for it. No one asked. They wrapped their arms around it as if it contained not goods, but something sacred. Then a single wave, sharp and brutal, swept across the deck, tearing both men from the ship in silence. When morning came, the sea had turned still as if nothing had happened. The crate remained where it was, drenched, nameless. The rain had stripped away any markings. Its tarp was half loose, the wood beneath already turning soft with mold. No one approached it, no one spoke of it, but everyone noticed that it sat precisely where those men had last been seen. On the 4th night after the storm, a young sailor knocked on the captain's door. His face was pale. "Sir," he said, barely above a whisper, "I heard something from inside the crate. Around 3 in the morning. It sounded like a growl. Faint, but alive." Author said nothing. He simply pulled on his coat, stepped into the night air, and walked toward the deck, toward the quiet shape near the railing. Something was waiting there, not just a crate, but a mystery the sea had tried to take and failed. Early the next morning, as the crew busied themselves with sails and ropes to bring the ship into port, Captain Arthur was already on deck. The sky had cleared. A soft sun shone through, casting a pale light over the tarp that lay torn and waterlogged, sour with damp and time. Without a word, he drew his dagger and cut along the frayed cords. The fabric slumped away, revealing a dark wooden crate, one corner cracked open from the storm. No markings, no numbers, not a single written word. He lifted the lid. What lay inside made him stop breathing. A leopard cub, soaked, filthy, skin drawn tight over jutting bones, lay curled at the bottom of the crate. Its eyes were closed. Its nose twitched faintly. The rise and fall of its chest was shallow, uneven, but there, on its left side, glowed something strange, a pale patch of fur shaped like a crescent moon, catching the morning light like silver fire. A breeze passed through, and the little body shivered. It was alive. Arthur leaned closer. His old eyes began to blur, not from salt, not from age, but from something that stirred deeper. Once, long ago, a small child had rested in his arms like this. That memory, long buried, rose like mist in the back of his mind. A grizzled sailor approached and looked into the crate. His face went suddenly pale. Moon spotted, he murmured under his breath. What did you say? Arthur asked. The man hesitated, swallowed. I heard stories when I was young, in the deep forest of Brazil. They call it the moon leopard, sombra da lua. Only appears once every century. Silver spots and a crescent mark over its heart. The elders said, whoever keeps it won't escape. Tragedy. Tragedy? Arthur echoed softly. Not because it's dangerous, the man said, because it doesn't belong to this world. Creatures like that, they walk between spirits. Humans were never meant to possess what doesn't wish to stay. Arthur didn't answer. His mind was already moving. 2 men, strangers, had boarded quietly in Brazil, kept to themselves. And during the storm, they had risked everything to protect this very crate, then vanished into the sea. He looked again at the animal, small, weak, but not ordinary. A thought crept in. This cub wasn't meant to be saved. It was meant to be smuggled. Perhaps it had been stolen, sold, shipped halfway across the world, a link in some chain of greed that ran through rainforests and markets and cages. And now it lay here, still breathing, still waiting. He reached in. The cub didn't move, just shivered. Gently, he lifted it into his arms. It made no sound, only curled, deeper, into the warmth. Not to possess, he murmured, just to protect, until it no longer needs me. He wrapped it in his coat and turned toward the captain's quarters. Behind him, the old sailor stood silent, watching, and said no more. And so, on a quiet morning after the storm, while the sea still remembered the wind, a choice was made, quiet and simple, like picking up a fallen life from the earth. From that moment on, the ship Hope was no longer quite the same, and neither was the man who sailed her. The Hope made harbor on a cold, wind-bitten morning. The air carried the scent of rotting wood and distant salt. Captain Arthur didn't wait for paperwork, nor for any ceremony. He cradled the bundled creature in his coat and left the ship in silence, bound for the old wooden house on the hillside, where his father had fallen ill. Or rather, where he once had been ill. The door was unlocked, the house unchanged, quiet, simple, still holding the shape of the past. but it was the kind of quiet that felt wrong. No faint scent of pipe smoke in the kitchen. No tap of cane on the floorboards. On the table, a letter, half written, the paper trembling with age and illness. "Son, don't worry. I'll wait, even through the storm." But the letter never reached its end, and neither did the waiting. Arthur didn't cry. He simply sat down, hands on the wood, eyes staring through the window. The old tree in front of the porch leaned with the wind, bent, brittle, and alone. And he understood, in that silence, what it meant to be the last one left in a family. From beneath the table the cub gave a weak whimper, a breath, more felt than heard. He knelt, placed his hand gently over its side. The fur was damp, knotted with grime. He named it Luca, a name he had kept locked inside for 10 years, the name of a child he had once failed to save, the boy who had not escaped the fire. 2 days passed. Luca worsened. He would not eat, did not respond. His eyes stayed shut, his belly hollowed. Each breath was a question with no promise of an answer. Arthur called for an old friend, Dr. Arjun, a retired field vet. When Arjun peeled back the matted fur along the cub's ribs, he froze. "This can't be—" "What is it?" Arthur asked. "This is a melanistic leopard, already extremely rare. But this coloration, it's something else." He pointed to the silver crescent on Luca's chest. Silvery rosettes, charcoal coat, gray eyes. It's a form of leucistic melanism. No record of it in the wild. If I'm right, this could be the first of its kind, and perhaps the last. That night, as wind whispered through the trees, Luca stirred. Slowly, silently, he lifted his head. His eyes opened wide, his body tense, alert. He was staring out the window. Arthur woke and followed his gaze. 12 hours later, weather stations confirmed the formation of a sudden tropical depression far out at sea, but Luca had sensed it the night before. From that moment on, Arthur watched closely. Luca reacted to things no human could see or hear. He whined when the old wooden clock ticked off rhythm. He lifted his head minutes before anyone knocked at the front gate, no matter the distance. He moved not like a creature of muscle and bone, but like something attuned to an older language. He was not simply a rescued animal. He was something else, refined, perceptive, as if nature had carved from silence a soul and sent it back to a man who had lost too much. Arthur had thought he saved a dying beast, but now he began to wonder. Perhaps it was the beast who was saving him. Luca survived, not by miracle, but by will, and by the quiet devotion Arthur poured into every drop of milk, every strip of meat, every slow stroke over the cub's trembling legs. Day after day passed in the little wooden kitchen. Luca still slept long, breathed slow, but his eyes no longer held that vacant glaze. Each morning, when light filtered through the window, the cub would lift his head, sniff the air, then tuck himself into Arthur's lap, like a child drifting between sleep and waking. By the 3rd week, he could walk, unsteady at first, but stronger with each step. His coat began to change, no longer dull and knotted, but softening into gray with charcoal rosettes blooming clearly across his back. But more than his recovery, it was something else that caught Arthur's attention. Luca had a habit, a ritual almost. On nights when the moon rose, especially full moon nights, he would climb onto the window ledge or slip out onto the wooden porch and sit in stillness for hours. He never growled, never moved, only stared skyward, his pale eyes reflecting the moon like quicksilver. twin gems that breathed in rhythm with the stars. Arthur never knew what he was thinking, but he sat beside him anyway. And for the first time in years, a hush settled over his heart, a hush that felt like peace. There was something in Luca that understood more than a wild animal should. He never cried when in pain, never whimpered when he stumbled or bled. He closed his eyes, bore it quietly. But when Arthur left the room, even for a minute, Luca would let out a soft whine. Not a call, not a demand. More like a sigh, a fragile sound, as if he could feel the emptiness swelling in the space Arthur left behind. From a dying creature in a nameless crate, Luca had become part of the house, and more than that, part of the man who lived in it. No words were spoken, no promises made, but something passed between them. Two lives once touched by darkness, not through reason, not through speech, but through a kind of silent understanding, pure and weightless, like the breath of the forest or the stillness of moonlight on a sleeping sea. Luca grew faster than Arthur had imagined. Within a few short months, he was lean, steady, and silent as breath itself, gliding across the wooden deck like a shadow stirred by wind. His old wounds faded without trace, and his eyes, brighter now, deeper, seemed to gaze beyond what men could ever reach. When Arthur received a commission to transport a special cargo from India's eastern shore back to South America, he brought Luca aboard, not as a pet, but as something far more enduring, a companion. The Hope once again split the sea, carrying not just crates and canvas, but two souls who had already crossed the edge of death and returned changed. During a resupply stop deep in the Amazon basin, the expedition stumbled upon an ancient village hidden from the world. As Luca stepped into the clearing, silence fell like a stone. No one cheered, no one moved, only fear. An old woman backed away, her voice a trembling whisper. A ponte do espiritu, the bridge between worlds. The village elder beat a carved drum and summoned the people. He declared that the creature, marked by the crescent white patch over its chest, was a living omen, a spirit reborn, and that the moon sacrifice must begin. Arthur tried to explain. They would not listen. Luca was taken, bound in a ceremonial hut, surrounded by ash and burning herbs. That night, as rain drummed through the canopy and the drums pulsed low like a heartbeat, Arthur crept into the village. With an old sailor's knife and the memory of a son he once failed to save, he cut Luca free and fled through a narrow path along the edge of the jungle. Behind them, the chants of invocation rose into the storm, but the danger had not passed. Less than 2 days later, while crossing a slow bend of river near the Brazilian border, they were ambushed, 5 men with rifles, dressed like surveyors, but eyes sharp with hunger. One of them, wearing a jaguar skin hat, stepped forward with a smirk. "So, this is where the shipment ran off to, huh, Captain?" Arthur froze. The 2 men who vanished in the storm, they were part of it. And Luca was the prize. A rare gem in a trade that spanned continents and cages. A gun cocked. "Hand it over, and you might live to sail again." Luca stepped forward. He did not run. He did not tremble. He raised his head and let out a sound unlike anything that belonged to a leopard. It was deeper, slower, like the earth, exhaling through ancient roots. And then the jungle answered. From every branch above, howls erupted. A storm of monkeys poured through the trees, shrieking, crashing, flinging broken limbs and leaves into a frenzy. The men panicked, slipping on wet moss, vanishing into the forest. their guns forgotten beneath the roar. When it ended, Luca returned to Arthur, calm and unmarked. They did not speak as they made their way back to the riverbank. The sun had set, the jungle was still. No one from the village pursued them. But before they reached the ship, a voice met them near the trees, hoarse, uncertain, but solemn. It was the elder. He said only one thing. Whoever walks with this spirit must ask himself one truth. Are you pure enough to remain beside it? Arthur said nothing. That night he sat beside Luca by a modest fire, his hand resting gently on the young leopard's shoulder, and in the quiet between the crackling embers, he understood. He was no longer the one protecting Luca. He had been chosen to walk with it for as long as nature would allow. After the ambush in the Amazon, Arthur understood something he had tried to deny. The world would not leave Luca in peace. So he acted. On board the Hope, he installed long-range radar, upgraded warning systems, and, most of all, issued one rule no one dared break. No strangers on deck. Ever. The ship was no longer just a carrier of cargo. It was now a floating sanctuary for a creature unlike any other. Luca adapted swiftly. He prowled the decks like a seasoned sailor. Old crewmen began to whisper that he brought luck. Since Luca's arrival, not a single breakdown, not a single delay. But there was more to it than luck. Luca could sense what no man could. One afternoon, beneath a clear sky, he suddenly whimpered and flattened himself to the floorboards, eyes wide, tail still. 6 hours later, a deep-sea current slammed the hull, just as he'd warned. Another time, off the coast of Indonesia, he let out a low, haunting growl in the middle of the night. The next morning, news arrived of a mild undersea quake, 300 nautical miles away. Arthur began to believe Luca wasn't just rare, he was a living barometer of the wild. And for a while, everything settled. The ship sailed, Luca thrived, and Arthur believed he'd done what was right, keeping the creature safe from a world that would devour it. Until one morning, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, from Europe, forwarded by an old friend. The sender, Dr. Elias Renfort, a renowned naturalist who had spent 2 decades studying the forest leopards of South America. Inside, a single paragraph. I happened to see a photograph, your leopard, in the corner of a maritime article. If I'm not mistaken, it is the East African silver-spotted leopard, a subspecies thought extinct for over 70 years. This animal carries a rare recessive gene, one that only expresses in the wild. If kept too long in captivity, it may never pass that trait on. And when it dies, the subspecies dies with it. Arthur read the words over and over, then looked at Luca, dozing in the sunlight, paws curled, whiskers twitching in dream. He had thought he was shielding Luca from the world, but perhaps he was unknowingly standing between Luca and the final purpose of his kind. That night, for the first time in months, Arthur left his cabin. He sat beside Luca on the open deck. The leopard was staring up at the moon, as always. The wind stirred through his silver hair. The moonlight caught the shimmer on Luca's back, like a whisper from another time. Arthur exhaled, not because he feared losing the creature, but because he knew real love sometimes means letting go. The last landing of the season came quietly. A thin forest edge at the rim of South America, just a supply stop. No one paid it much mind. A few barrels of fresh water, a couple nights of rest. Then they'd sail home. Arthur took Luca ashore, as always. No leash, no command, no need. Luca walked beside him, not like a pet, but like a shadow, or perhaps, more truly, like a piece of the wild itself that had never truly belonged to man. On the second afternoon, as they crossed a grassy slope near a stream, Luca stopped, ears high, eyes fixed. From the brush ahead, a shape emerged, dark and fluid as a ribbon of smoke, a female leopard, slightly smaller than Luca, her coat midnight black, brushed faintly with silver streaks like ash on wind. She did not growl. She did not flee. She simply stood, poised and still, as though she'd known this moment was always meant to happen. They circled each other, once, twice, not hostile, not afraid, just understanding. Then she turned and vanished into the trees. Luca did not follow, but that night he did not sleep curled at Arthur's feet. He lay near the door, eyes wide, fixed on the forest. The next morning, Luca disappeared for 2 hours. When he returned, he was unharmed, no dirt, no cuts. But on his back clung a single dry leaf, and his eyes were different, brighter, but distant, as if a part of him had already gone and was waiting for the rest to catch up. That night, he lay near Arthur again, but not close. When Arthur reached out, a gesture they had shared countless times, Luca pulled away, gently, not out of fear, but with care, as if trying to make space, to make leaving less cruel. On the third morning, Luca was gone from the deck. Arthur searched and found him at the forest's edge, standing beside the same black-furred leopard from before. Luca turned, did not growl, did not cry. He walked back toward Arthur, slowly, each step feeling like the closing of a chapter. He stopped before the old man, lowered his head, and gently bit the cuff of Arthur's sleeve, then released it. A single hair, soft and pale, fell to the earth. No words, no sound, but everything was said. Luca turned, and this time he did not look back. Arthur bent down and picked up the hair. It weighed nothing, and yet it was heavier than any cargo he had carried across all the seas. That night the moon rose, the sea was still, and on the deck of the Hope an old man sat alone, a leopard hair in his hand, his eyes fixed on the trees, where a piece of his heart had quietly walked away. That morning the sky was still and clear. Arthur opened the wooden crate one last time, the same one that once held a breath so fragile it barely stirred the air. Now he opened it, not to protect, but to release. Luca stepped out, not with haste, nor hesitation. He paused at the edge of the sunlight, turned to look at Arthur, and held that gaze for a long moment. Then he let out a deep, low call, not of pain or fear, but something softer, a farewell, a thank you. And with that, he turned and walked into the forest, light as when he had first arrived. Time passed. 1 year later, the Hope returned to that coastline, not for cargo, not by schedule, but for something unseen, a quiet promise between a man and the wild. The ship slowed. The wind held its breath. Arthur stood at the bow, fingers curled around a single leopard whisker, the one Luca had left behind. From the edge of the trees, a shape emerged. A leopard, powerful, calm, unmistakable. Beside it, a smaller form, sleek, pale, with a coat dusted in silver like a dream born from moonlight. They did not approach nor flee. They simply stood, watching the sea, watching him. And from that year on, every season, like a ritual older than memory, the silver-sailed ship would return. It never stayed long, just enough to see and be seen. At the forest's edge, the dappled shape would appear again, silent, steady. No words, no signs, but presence itself became the language, a language that said this friendship was never lost. It only returned to where it belonged, people asked Arthur, years later, "Did you ever regret letting him go?" He would smile gently, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, and say, "No one really keeps anything. We're only allowed to walk beside it for as long as time and truth will permit. And when the moment comes to part, we don't feel we've lost. We feel honored to have been chosen to walk with something that rare, that beautiful." Luca was never a possession. He was a lesson in life, in wilderness, in friendship, the kind that needs no words, no collar, no promise, just a shared breath and the quiet understanding to stay beside one another in the moments that matter. Arthur never raised another animal after that. On board the Hope, Luca's silver whisker lay inside a small wooden box, resting beneath a faded sea chart that Arthur never sailed without. And every year, beneath a rising moon, the ship would return, sailing once more past the same stretch of silent forest. It never called, never searched, never interfered. It simply passed, slow, steady, as though honoring something only the heart could name. And from the shore, sometimes, a leopard would appear, glowing faintly in the silver light, watching, remembering. No one can say if the tale is true, but no one ever tries to deny it, because some friendships live beyond time, silent as the moon, enduring as the forest.